Civilized societies require civilized places. Uncivilized times require special attention to the task of being a civilized place. This summer has presented us with a series of spectacles of absolute barbarism, of beheadings and burnings in the deserts of the Middle East. We saw the killing of cartoonists in Paris, and some of the horror came closer to home in a cafe in Sydney. Sometimes those events feel very close. It was the sister of a former McKinsey partner colleague of mine who was killed in that cafe. We've seen a number of lone wolf plots to cut the heads off Australians thwarted. It will only be a matter of time before one succeeds. The test of any civilization is how it reacts in a time of fear or threat. I lived in the United Kingdom when the IRA were bombing the mainland. The bookshop I browsed in, the supermarket I shopped in, had bombs placed in them. Indeed, they were in the shop when I was in the supermarket and buying a book, and by some piece of luck, they failed to explode. But I saw what happens when people start to live in fear. They start to create a sense of security amongst their own kind by defining themselves not in terms of what they are, but what they are not. Definition is framed not in the terms of our higher selves, but in terms of the other. Quickly, the other is generalized and caricatured, and the other becomes a group identity rather than the names of individuals. Those forces creating the other that I saw in the United Kingdom resulted in dozens of innocent Irishmen jailed for crimes they didn't commit and countless acts of violence on the street that were never seen. The forces creating all that we saw in 9/11 were similar. Civilized people did uncivilized things, like torturing people in black sites. And those uncivilized feelings are on the rise again, including here in Australia. In the cowardly anonymity of the internet, hateful things are said about Islam and Islamic Australians, as indeed they often are about Jewish people or people with particular sexual orientations. And troublingly, some of these trolls of the internet have ventured into more public places in recent times. In times like now, institutions have a responsibility to remind themselves what it is to be a civilized place. And there is a story I uncovered this summer that speaks right to the heart, not only of what it is to be a civilized place, but also how the college played a role in creating the forces for Australia being a civilised place. It's a story about the preamble to our Constitution. Now, in Australia, we don't talk much about our Constitution or our nation's founders. Perhaps that's because, unlike the United States, whose Constitution was won by a war of independence, and our founders, at this distance at least, don't seem to be the larger-than-life characters of people like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin. Yet our Constitution is no less important for whom we are today. And the one small episode I want to recount tonight highlights the power for today of returning to our origins. And in a college with a motto et nova et vetera, it should be a natural thing for us to do. The episode I want to touch on is a story about what freedom and diversity mean in Australia and how the community here in this college shaped that debate. Our Constitution was created through a series of great conventions in the 1890s, when this college was still young and John Macfarlane was still master. Our Constitution secures few freedoms. We have no Bill of Rights like the United States. Therefore, those rights protected in our Constitution are precious and central to securing Australia as a civilised place. One of those freedoms is the freedom of religion, and that no religion would be established by the government. This was an idea that was present from the very first convention back in 1891. Right back then, Tasmanian lawyer and Unitarian Andrew Inglis Clark proposed a clause modelled on the First Amendment to the US Constitution, which protects the freedom of religion. Now, by the time of a later convention, the Adelaide Convention in 1897, a move was afoot to include a feature not present in the US model, the recognition of deity in the preamble. It was an idea that would give a quite different meaning to the freedom of religion in Australia. There would be freedom of religion, according to this idea, but religion could be a point of reference in our public and legal life. Now, this idea, potent with potential, was defeated at that convention, 17 votes to 11. Defeat, however, sparked a public debate of considerable intensity. And the public movement in favour of including the recognition of deity in our Constitution was led from here. From here at Ormond, by the professor, one of the professors of theology, Professor Lawrence Rentoul. Now, you might think that kind of idea would make him a conservative, but actually he was a well-known liberal who earned his stripes fighting Presbyterian fundamentalists of the day and was known as Fighting Larry. What he fought for was something broad. What he fought for in the end was something that became an interfaith movement, with rabbis speaking in favour of the notion that we should acknowledge deity in the Constitution, and the leading Jewish politician of the time, Isaac Isaacs, championing it. Now, if Ormond was the centre at championing this idea, it was also very involved in the opposition to it. One of the great friends of the college, Henry Bournes Higgins, who donated the shield that hangs on the wall in memory of his son, was also the greatest opponent of including this clause. Now, Rentoul and Higgins weren't just ships in the night. They dined together at this table and could be found in conversation in the Master's residence in Allen House. Indeed, in a mark of what it means to be a civilised place, both men were great friends of John Henry Macfarlane, and they spent their summers fly fishing with him. Now, when we talk about our value of diversity, having roots in our history, these are the kinds of events we refer to. These are the stories that are our cultural DNA and that are important to what makes us a civilised place. For here in this clash of titans of the time was a powerful example of how diversity should work. Two people with big ideas, big enough to change the direction of a nation, conducting an extended debate, not just with civility, but with friendship. They could do it in a community like ours and build a community like ours through their debate rather than pull it apart. Now, how this debate played out on the national stage ultimately shaped the way we understand freedom in Australia. So it's worth saying a word about it. For when the day finally came that in the last of the conventions, the proposal would be raised again that deity be referred to in the Constitution, it was actually a Catholic, because Protestants had played such a prominent part, who moved the motion that it be included. It was a Catholic barrister, Patrick Glynn of South Australia. And his words, and those that followed, they're short, but they're worth recalling. They speak of ideals and understandings on which Australia was built and which are under pressure today. Glynn moved, as the records of the day note, on what was almost a century and a bit ago to this day, on the 2nd of March, the following words be inserted after the word Constitution, humbly relying upon the blessing of Almighty God. And then he explained again what these words were for. These are his words. The words I wish to insert are simple and unsectarian. They are expressive of our ultimate hope of the final end of all our aspirations, of the great elemental truth upon which all creeds are based and to which the lines of our faiths converge. He then went on to say, in an affirmation of pure reverence adherents of all creeds, sinking their differences of form and method, can join and will find the spirit of toleration in them, growing strong under a sense of their common aim. It will thus become a pledge of religious toleration. Then came the exchange that is defining of the meaning of freedom of religion in Australia and that shaped how we understand freedom more broadly. Henry Bourne-Higgins, father of Mervyn Bourne-Higgins, rose in opposition to the recognition of deity in our Constitution, saying that the United States Supreme Court, even though the United States had no such recognition in their Constitution, had declared America a Christian country. And so how much greater was the danger that Australia too would be declared a Christian country. Then, in reply, John Quick, one of the other great shapers of the Constitution, took to his feet. He argued that the very generality of that clause made it clear that Australia was not to be a Christian nation, but a nation where people of all faiths could feel truly secure because faith itself was respected here. And here too are the unmistakable echo of the college's founding words, with their own roots deep in the Scottish Enlightenment. Words in our own college constitution to this day, that Ormond will be a college open to people of all faiths and none. And as he made this argument, Quick listed some of the religions whose place in Australia was to be secured by this clause. You might have expected him merely to name Christianity, but he went out of his way not only to name Judaism, but Islam as well. It was clear from the very beginning of our nation that people of all those religions were to have a home here and were to be safe here. So when dark forces suggest that any particular religion is un-Australian or not compatible with who we are, we need to remind ourselves that the founders of our Constitution were explicit that this was a country for Christians and Jews and Muslims and other religions as well. The preamble of our Constitution also provides us with a much richer understanding of diversity. It's not about mere tolerance of difference. It is about embracing difference as something that strengthens us, and not just trivial differences of taste, but truly profound ones. We are asked to value worldviews and whole systems of belief different to our own. And if we truly do value the beliefs of others, then we can move from what you can call sympathy, I can imagine what it would be like for me to be in your shoes, to true empathy. I can imagine what it would be like to be you in your shoes. This is an affirmation of diversity as empathy. And this type of diversity reframes debates about freedom of speech, not just freedom of religion. If we truly value diversity, then we will debate the most profound differences, as Higgins and Rentoul did, in a spirit of respect. The sort of respect that means you can put your words down at the end of the day and go fishing together, or whatever else you do as friends. And we should always ask here, does the quality of our debate pass the fishing test? And if our debate can always pass that fishing test, then it is culture rather than law or rules that secures the freedom of speech. And if our debate passes that kind of fishing test almost all the time, on the odd occasion where accident or anger or the desire for radical freedom leads to hate or hurt, we will survive, because we know it's not what characterises how we relate to one another, and that we should be a place of grace enough to embrace apology. In a community like ours, saying sorry is a sign of strength, not of weakness. We are only weak when we fail to rebuild trust by saying sorry. Diversity, of course, is not easy, but then life at Ormond is meant to be a bit edgy, to have points of challenge, because you don't grow if you live in your comfort zone. Diversity creates a zone of discomfort where we all grow and learn. And while it may not always be comfortable, diversity creates a place for everyone to belong. And I've never understood this point about belonging more profoundly than when, starting last year at the local state primary school, one of my daughters came home and said, "Dad, what I love about this school is there's so much diversity that there is no normal." We are not yet a college where there is no normal, but the aspiration that we should be is the sentiment of the college's founders, like Rentoul, Higgins and Macfarlane. And it is the aspiration we should have as a nation to ensure we stay a civilised place. Thank you.